If it's an invasion, are we at war with Venezuela? Can we kick out anyone from Venezuela? Not just the illegal aliens, not just Tren de Aragua, because we're at war with Venezuela. I think this is a very difficult case for the Trump administration to make right now. Now, maybe they have facts at their disposal that they haven't been able to share in public. And they have been making the case in court, John, in these Tren de Aragua deportation cases, that there are serious national security implications here, that the Tren de Aragua and the Venezuelan government are intertwined.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. The suspension of habeas corpus. I welcome Professor John Yoo, a senior research fellow at the Civitas Institute, distinguished visiting professor at the School of Civic Leadership at the University of Texas at Austin, as well as the Emanuel Heller Professor of Law at the University of California at Berkeley. Professor, a very good evening to you. It is April 1861. The President, Abraham Lincoln, suspends habeas corpus. This is the suspension clause of the Constitution. In the event of rebellion or invasion, the suspension of habeas corpus. However, there begins the argument. Let us look to what happened in 1861 as a guide for what may be ahead of us here in the 21st century, if and when the Trump administration moves through with its thinking to suspend habeas corpus in order to avoid the necessary due process for those being deported in these next years. The suspension clause, rebellion or invasion. Now we come to what went wrong. Chief Justice Roger Taney, infamous for the Dred Scott case. However, he stands up against his president. What is Mr. Taney's case? What is Mr. Lincoln's case? Good evening to you.
John, great to be with you. And I couldn't imagine a better person to talk with and a better time to talk about it with than you and Lincoln and the suspension of habeas corpus. And what was a debate that we thought only maybe had to come up with the Civil War, maybe with FDR, has come back to us because a Trump administration official proposed the idea again of the president suspending habeas corpus, this time to deal with immigration. Here's the historical setting. As you say, we're right at the beginning of the Civil War. President Lincoln, by the way, Congress is not in session. It's not meeting yet. President Lincoln, after the firing of Fort Sumter, on his own authority, takes money out of the Treasury without an appropriation, raises a military without authorization from Congress, imposes a blockade on the South, and has the Union begin offensive operations. Part of what he did was to rush volunteers from places like Boston and New York on the train to defend Washington, D.C. Remember, Washington, D.C. sits between Virginia, one of the seceding states, and Maryland. And the loyalty of Maryland is in doubt. Now, I haven't gone on the Northeast Corridor too recently between Philadelphia and Washington, but back then there was no direct rail link. You would have to take the train from New York to Baltimore, get off of one station, walk or take a carriage, and then get on another train to get to DC. And in that space, Union troops were attacked by people in Maryland. There were a lot of Confederate sympathizers in Maryland. Maryland is a slave state. Maryland is the home state of Chief Justice Roger Taney. So the Union general arrests a fellow named John Merryman, who is thought to be a Confederate officer, sympathizer. Apparently he's drilling cavalry and troops for the Confederacy. He's held by the Union Army, and Chief Justice Taney, a Baltimore native, happens to be in Baltimore at the time. There's some historians who think he rushed there from Washington for this purpose. Merryman files for a writ of habeas corpus. And the writ of habeas corpus is a simple device. It's in the Constitution, though, and it says, whenever the government detains anybody, you have the right to be brought to a court, to a judge, and the government must explain why it's holding you. Habeas corpus in Latin just means you have the body. Chief Justice Taney hears the case, and he says that Merryman must be released, that it's unconstitutional for Lincoln to take all these steps at the beginning of the Civil War. And this goes to the root of your question, John, what does the habeas corpus provision mean and who gets to trigger it? Tawney says that the habeas corpus provision is in Article 1, the powers and limits on Congress. And so Tawney says only Congress can, as you said, in time of invasion or rebellion, when the public safety requires it, suspend the writ. Lincoln, and this is why I think Lincoln is the only president in our history who has really defied a judicial order. Lincoln orders the Union general there to ignore Tawney, to not release Merryman. And Tawney, according to historians, no shrinking judicial violet he, goes out onto the front steps of the Baltimore courthouse and in front of apparently a crowd of 2,000 people, and says because of Lincoln's actions, all of our American liberties are being oppressed by a dictator. But there's important questions. Important questions still unresolved. Who gets to suspend the writ of habeas corpus? When you read the text, John, notice it's written in the passive tense. It doesn't say who gets to suspend it. It just says when you can suspend it.
We come to the question itself. Does it require Congress's permission? Mr. Lincoln either refuted that or ignored it, but it's back. Your presentation says that right now the Trump administration entertaining suspending habeas corpus is not seeking Congress's permission. The puzzle here is that it wasn't just once that Mr. Lincoln did it. Old Capitol Prison was filled with men who were being arrested as sympathizers and kept there for a long time, maybe years. There was never an accounting, and they just disappeared. Old Capitol Prison was on the same spot the Supreme Court building is today. So this is all very comfortable for us to look at our geography and our history. Lincoln did not make a convincing argument for not needing Congress other than speed. Is there, in anything that you've read, you mentioned William Galston's piece in the Wall Street Journal, is there anything fresh on that argument, or is it still a matter of interpretation?
Well, the fresh thing that historians have written about in the last few years is what actually happened. Because many people like Mr. Galston take the view, well, Congress ultimately did approve everything Lincoln did at the beginning of the Civil War. Lincoln had issued a special message. Lincoln had sense of timing. He, called Congress into session on July 4th, 1861. And he sent them a message saying, I had to act, as you said, John, with swiftness because of this unprecedented crisis. Please bless everything I did. Congress does. Congress approves removing money from the Treasury. It approves raising the military, but it doesn't approve the suspension of habeas corpus. Congress doesn't do anything about habeas corpus until March of 1863, after the Battle of Antietam, after the Emancipation Proclamation. And then, regardless of what Congress did or not, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus throughout the entire country. And he kept it suspended until the end of the Civil War. So whether Congress acted to bless what he did or not, for 2 years, Lincoln, the first 2 years of the war, Lincoln was still ordering the military to grab people he thought were sympathizers, spies, and Confederates, hold them without trial, subject them to military trial if necessary. And then even after Congress passed a law, Lincoln basically still continued to ignore it and kept habeas corpus suspended throughout the country anyway. And one other thing that a historian in New Light is, the courts didn't try to stop him. There was a case after the Civil War where the Supreme Court says, well, if the courts are open and civilian government is operating, then habeas corpus should still work. But notice the Supreme Court waited until the war was over. And during the Civil War, the Supreme Court and the lower courts never ordered anyone released during this period of the suspension of the right of habeas corpus.
Mr. Lincoln made a rhetorical argument that is persuasive until you think about it, that the imperative is to protect the Constitution. and therefore he obeys that before he obeys the courts. Does that have merit, John, all these more than 100 years later?
His argument is extra constitutional. He said he would say things. He was wonderful in the analogies he would draw by making them relatable to regular people. He would say, of course, if you had a disease, you would amputate a limb to save your whole body. And he would say, isn't that like me? I maybe not be following every letter of the Constitution, but I'm saving the Union. And without the Union, you can't have a Constitution. He said, or all the laws but one. And here, the one is the habeas corpus provision. He says, do the Confederates get to violate all the laws? And I still have to obey this habeas corpus provision in fighting them. So Lincoln's claim, now he was very careful not to really ever write down that he was deciding something on this basis, but in public and speeches and letters, he would say, I have to preserve the Union first. And only by preserving the Union do I have the ability to protect the Constitution.
We come now to Abraham Lincoln, however, certainly a vivid figure and a man who knew how to speechify and win a point. And Professor, because this turns on the suspension clause, rebellion or invasion, clearly there was a rebellion underway in 1861. Invasion is another matter. And there is a contentious point that the U.S. has been invaded by undocumented aliens. So I come to that point, not in total. We're not talking about everyone who came here the last 4 years or the last 40 years. We're talking about how the administration has emphasized again and again that there are criminal elements sent into the United States wittingly by bad actors outside. Tren Aragua is mentioned again and again. And we come to this argument that Mr. Lincoln made, and I wonder if it has purchase here. Mr. Lincoln wrote, under cover of liberty of speech, liberty of the press, and habeas corpus, the Confederacy, quote, hoped to keep on foot among us a most efficient corps of spies, informers, suppliers, and aiders, and abettors of their cause in 1,000 ways. That is spookily similar to language we've heard about Tren Aragua come here to undermine the credibility of the Constitution. Is there merit to it, Professor?
I think it's a hard case to make out. First, you have the question, can President Trump, like President Lincoln before him, suspend habeas corpus? Can he rely on the same claim? Even though the powers listed in Article 1 of the Constitution, where the Congress is discussed, it's written in the passive tense. Does that mean either the president or Congress can suspend the writ? But suppose you get past that. Then, as you say, John, the harder question is, factually, are we suffering an invasion? Does the clause actually fit the times? Or do the times fit the clause? And that would depend on having to show that some of these gangs that have infiltrated the flow of refugees and illegal aliens who've come into the United States, is that an invasion? Do they work for the Venezuelan government? If it's an invasion, are we at war with Venezuela? Can we kick out anyone from Venezuela? Not just the illegal aliens, not just Tren Aragua people, but anyone from Venezuela, because we're at war with Venezuela. I think this is a very difficult case for the Trump administration to make right now. Now, maybe they have facts at their disposal that they haven't been able to share in public. And they have been making the case in court, John, in these Tren Aragua deportation cases, that there are serious national security implications here, that the Tren Aragua and the Venezuelan government are intertwined, and they are sending people here to destabilize our country. But I think the Trump administration, and this is something they could learn from Lincoln, as you say, Lincoln was good at speechifying, but he also believed in making his case to the public. You know, he didn't pretend that he wasn't suspending habeas corpus. He openly and honestly talked to the American people, using these homespun analogies and homilies to explain himself. And at times he did say, look, I might have to violate the Constitution to save the country and to save the Union. But he was open and honest about it. And I think that's where the Trump administration could do better, is if they really believe we're under invasion, Give us the facts so that the American people can decide too.
I love this that you quote. You're very fair-minded, Professor, in quoting Lincoln so persuasively. Lincoln asked, "Must I shoot a simple-minded soldier boy who deserts, while I must not touch a hair of a wily agitator who induces him to desert?" Great question, Mr. Lincoln. You win. Okay, here we are. Has Congress spoken on this matter?
No, and that's maybe the greater fault is you go back and compare this to 1861, and Congress does approve all the emergency measures Lincoln had to take at the beginning of the Civil War, except for the writ of habeas corpus being suspended. Again, they didn't wait. They waited till 1863, 2 years, because they were not sure. And in general, this was a Congress back then that thought that Lincoln, if you remember your Civil War history, they thought Lincoln was being too moderate, right? They wanted Lincoln to be tougher and more aggressive against the South.
The radical Republicans.
Yeah, the radical Republicans. They thought that the whole Constitution should be suspended during the period of the Civil War so that you could really get the job done against the Confederates. Here today, John, Congress is missing in action. Where we are seeing story after story every day about the fights between President Trump and the courts about immigration. I see President Trump's policy point is how could President Biden be allowed to open up the borders and let in, estimates are maybe 12 million illegal aliens. And then to kick them out, I have to give each person a hearing. Each person gets a right of a writ of habeas corpus. We'll never be able to deport all those people. That's Trump's claim. But the Lincoln example, I think the Civil War example, is you really need to show an invasion or a rebellion to be able to take that kind of extreme measure.
30 seconds, Professor. What do you recommend Congress can do? 30 seconds.
I think Congress could overhaul the immigration laws. They could make the process of deportation faster, and they could be clearer if they think it's an invasion or not, whether the writ of habeas corpus should be suspended or not. I think if the president and Congress agree, then the courts are going to be much more comfortable blessing national policy than if president just acts alone.
Professor John Yoo at the Civitas Institute and Berkeley School of Law. I'm John Batchelor.